galaxy explodes. The rebels return. You can relive it all with Kenner's Star Wars Return of the Jedi collection.
The fleet's diving in a hyperdrive. Got it moving.
New B-Wing fighters and B-Wing pilot action figures, each sold separately. Batteries not included.
Asteroid belt, lowering wings. Hold on tight. Test our laser cannon. Check. Gyro cockpit stable. Now for some evasive action. We're home free.
New B-Wing fighter and B-Wing pilot action figures, each sold separately from Kenner's Star Wars Return of the Jedi collection.
The B-Wing is one of the most iconic ships of the original trilogy, although I say that about all of them. Its completely alien design stood out among the fighters, bombers, and battleships of the original trilogy's World War II aesthetic and made it an instant classic. As such, it should come as no surprise that this ship has a long and detailed history, which we are going to explore today. I'm Joey from Radio Free Coruscant, and this is the Blade of the Rebellion.
Steady. A little closer. Fire!
That's impossible.
Design. The Slain and Corporal B-Wing was a line of large cruciform starfighters with a large engine block, folding S-foils, and numerous weapons. Officially, the ship's default orientation was horizontal, but to make describing the craft easier, we are going to rotate it to be vertical for reasons that will make sense momentarily. Most of the craft's length, or width, or height, depending on how it is positioned, came from a massive wing to which all of its other components were attached. At the top of the wing, when looking at it vertically like we are, it had a cylindrical cockpit section which was able to rotate gyroscopically in most versions of the ship to keep the pilot facing in the same direction throughout its maneuvers. While this was significantly more important in atmospheric battles, which the B-Wing rarely partook in, it still helped avoid disorientation in space battles as well. The cockpit could also be jettisoned as an escape pod, and the pilot sat in an ejector seat like other starfighters as well in case that was insufficient. Below the cockpit, after a short neck, was the main body of the B-Wing. This was a large square pod containing 4 engines at the rear, intakes for the cooling system at the front, and the shield generators, power cells, and more inside. Just below that were the S-foils, which contained the ship's repulsor lifts and were tipped with cannons. Continuing down, the B-Wing's primary airfoil housed additional systems, including the navigation sensor. And finally, the bottom was tipped with the main weapons pod. Of course, the design varied slightly depending on the variant. There were several different versions of the B-Wing, dating all the way back to the Clone Wars. H-60 Tempest Bomber. In both Legends and canon, the story of the B-Wing begins with the H-60 Tempest Bomber. This was a very rare and unpopular bomber built for and rejected by the Galactic Republic. Republic Navy planners disliked the ship due to its high operating costs and unusual flying wing design. A few squadrons worth were built and sold to independent militaries, but most sat unused in warehouses and were sent to the scrapyards. The Rebel Alliance managed to secure a few Tempests at an incredible discount and used them in the Outer Rim, but the craft never saw much use even there. The size of the H-60 has never been revealed, but we can estimate it to be roughly the same size as the B-Wing, or about 17 meters wide. It cost 172,000 credits, flew at 950 kilometers per hour, required 2 crew, and carried 110 kilograms of cargo. It was not equipped with a hyperdrive by default, but could be fitted with one after the fact. What it was equipped with were weapons: 2 medium laser cannons, a twin light ion cannon, a proton torpedo launcher, and a ventral bomb bay. The H-60 Tempest may have been an abject failure, but its bizarre design was just the inspiration needed for a Mon Calamari engineer named Quarry to begin work on a starfighter of his own. Prototype B6. Prototype B6, better known as the Blade Wing and worse known as the Bevel Wing, was the first true B-Wing. It was designed in secret on the remote planet Shantipole by the hermit engineer Quarry around 5 BBY. It was purely a personal project, an experiment to see how powerful he could make a starfighter. He combined elements of several Slain and Corporal starships, including the basic shape of the H-60, the rotating cockpit of the T-6 shuttle, and the folding wings of the V-19 Torrent. He attached all of this to an extremely powerful power generator and a composite beam laser capable of taking down entire cruisers by itself. Quarry was perfectly content to just tinker with and look at the B6, as he was no pilot. However, eventually Hera Syndulla and Sabine Wren of the Rebellion caught wind of the starfighter and came looking for it. Quarry resisted them at first, but eventually decided that the two were the perfect pilot and gunner for the ship, and that this was likely his only chance to see his hard work in action. They piloted the ship to the planet Ibar, where they broke an Imperial blockade so that the Phoenix Cell could deliver aid to the planet. The Blade Wing measured 16.9 meters long and could fly at 950 kilometers per hour. We don't know how much Quarry spent on it, but considering its custom-made weapons system, it was probably a lot. It was armed with 3 Armec SW5 ion cannons, 2 Giril SQD-1NK high-intensity blasters, a proton torpedo launcher loaded with Red Snapper proton torpedoes, and of course the composite beam laser. It required 1 pilot and 1 gunner. Having been mutually impressed by the Blade Wing's performance, Quarry and the Rebellion began searching for a manufacturer to produce more of them. And the best choice was clear: Slain and Corporal. ASF-01 B-Wing Assault Starfighter. The iconic B-Wing used by the Rebellion was the ASF-01 B-Wing. After Bail Organa secured the assistance of Slain and Corporal, Quarry and the S&K engineers began work on Project Shantipole. Over the next few years, they refined the design of the B6 into something that was able to be mass-produced. It became slightly slower and less maneuverable, and lost the complicated composite beam laser, but the finished product was one of the most dangerous starfighters ever built. It was more heavily armed than some patrol craft and corvettes. Despite losing the mini super laser, it was still capable of destroying capital ships, perhaps even more effectively than before. The B-Wing was present for many of the major battles of the end of the Galactic Civil War. It was most prominent at the Battle of Endor, where several followed Lando Calrissian into battle against the Death Star, and B-Wings also fought at Malastare, Kuat, and Jakku. After the war, B-Wings were commonly used in smaller local militaries, and even in civilian starship racing. In the Legends continuity, the B-Wing was designed directly by Slain and Corporal, with Admiral Akbar replacing Quarry as the project leader, though he did not create the prototype. It was meant to replace the aging Y-Wing. Other than that, the Legends B-Wing and Canon B-Wing are essentially the same. The B-Wing measured 16.9 meters long, 2.9 meters wide, and 2.5 meters tall with the S-foils closed, or 7.3 meters tall with them open. It had a maximum speed of 950 kilometers per hour, and cost 220,000 credits new, or 120,000 used. It had a Class II hyperdrive and a crew of 1. It was armed with 2 Krupex MG9 proton torpedo launchers, a laser-guided bomb bay, and 4 low-power targeting lasers. It had 2 possible energy weapon loadouts. One carried 4 Giril R9X heavy laser cannons and at least 2 ion cannons. The other carried 3 RMEC SW-7A ion cannons, 1 RX-9 heavy cannon, and 1 to 2 Giril-72 twin auto blasters. B-Wing E Starfighter. The B-Wing Expanded was an upgraded B-Wing. It was largely identical to the original, except the cockpit was extended by 3 meters to accommodate a passenger and 50 kilograms of cargo. And apparently a lot of legroom. Most humanoids aren't even 2 meters tall, let alone 3 meters long sitting down. There was also a later variant called the B-Wing E2, which added an additional torpedo launcher and a removable magazine with storage for 12 extra torpedoes. In Legends, Admiral Akbar flew a B-Wing E2 as his personal shuttle until it was sabotaged, causing him to crash it into an utterly unique structure called the Cathedral of the Winds on the planet Vortex, destroying it and killing hundreds of the Vors who lived there and played the building as a musical instrument. Fortunately, the cathedral was rebuilt many years later, though the same could not be said for Akbar's B-Wing. B-Wing Mark II. In canon, the B-Wing was eventually replaced by the B-Wing Mark II. Sadly, we know absolutely nothing about this ship other than that it existed. Its production was likely disrupted by the signing of the Galactic Concordance, which would almost certainly have not been kind to a starfighter as heavily armed as the B-Wing. Thus, the Mark II was likely cancelled, and any that were produced were probably stripped of their weapons or scrapped entirely. We can infer that it must have been considerably larger than the original B-Wing, though, as Mark II cockpits were used by the Resistance to build the Resistance Transport and Resistance Transport Pod. On both ships, the cockpit is quite a bit bigger than that of the original B-Wing, being able to comfortably fit Finn, Rose, and BB-8 with a small amount of room to roam about the cabin, even on the minuscule transport pod. Resistance B-Wing. Despite the apparent failure of the B-Wing Mark II, the Starfighter lived on. At some point before 34 ABY, an as-yet final version was produced, the B-Wing fighter, better known as the Resistance B-Wing. It featured a much more slim and angular construction, especially in the now very geometric cockpit. Unfortunately, we know even less about the Resistance B-Wing than we did the Mark II, even though we actually have images of this one. It appears to be back down to the size of the original B-Wing, and it is armed with at least 4 energy weapons and a proton bomb bay. Despite its moniker as the Resistance B-Wing, the Resistance had few B-Wings and used them sparingly. And that's everything there is to know about the B-Wing. Everything except the origin of the name. The B-Wing, as you will notice, looks distinctly unlike the letter B. The X, Y, and A wings all resemble their letters, but not the B-Wing. This is because when Joe Johnston and Bill George were designing the A-Wing and B-Wing for Return of the Jedi, they labeled the ships A-Fighter and B-Fighter respectively in the design diagrams. Eventually, these labels were converted into the in-universe names. It was seemingly just a coincidence that the A-Fighter looked like the letter A. For further trivia, Bill George was so involved in the design of this ship that his colleagues nicknamed it the Bill-Wing Fighter. Anyway, that's everything there is to know about the B-Wing. Let me know in the comments what you think of the ship, and which version is your favorite. I have to assume it's the original, which is my favorite as well, but if you prefer one of the other models, I'd love to hear about it. Please subscribe as well. You have to. Admiral Akbar's orders. I'll see you next week. RFC, out.